The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how black unionists organized the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom, how Republicans used organized money and organized outrage to become the party of plutocrats, plus Bill Press on why psychiatrists are saying Trump is unfit to hold office and cannot change. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. William P. Jones has written extensively on the history of labor unions and race. In his highly acclaimed book on the 1963 March on Washington, he reminds us of the critical role of black trade unionists in making that historic event happen. And we say hello to William P. Jones, professor of history at the University of Minnesota and president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. He's also the author of numerous books, including The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. William P. Jones, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. Your book on the March on Washington, as the title makes clear, is about the forgotten history. And that history is that this was as much about economic justice as it was voting rights and the right to a decent education. Central to this story is the role of A. Philip Randolph. What do we need to know about him as a labor leader to understand his role in the 1963 March on Washington?
Well, that's right. A. Philip Randolph, at the time of the march, was probably the most prominent civil rights leader in the United States. Martin Luther King, in part because of the march, would emerge as the best-known leader, but Randolph was routinely called the Dean of Civil Rights. And it's important to know that he was a labor leader as well as a civil rights leader. He was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a union of mostly African-American workers who worked on luxury train yards or train cars in the United States, serving those. And A. Philip Randolph was responsible for building that into a large national union that both improved the economic situation of those workers, but also significantly served as something like a civil rights organization, being able to spread the word about mobilizations nationally and to mobilize people, not just its own members, but people in communities across the country.
And as the book tells us, the idea of a march on Washington that focused on economic justice took place long before 1963. Tell us about that first vision.
Right. So the idea for a March on Washington of African Americans was first proposed in 1941, and A. Philip Randolph's union took that up as a national cause. At the time, the primary objective of that march was to demand jobs in the defense industry. This was just as the U.S. was entering the Second World War, and the federal government was investing significantly in the defense mobilization. This had the effect of lifting, for white workers, lifting them out of the Great Depression. So finally ending the Great Depression. But for black workers, most of them found themselves discriminated against in those jobs, excluded from those jobs. So the primary objective of that original March on Washington was a ban on racial discrimination in the defense industries.
And that march was called off. What happened?
Well, it was called off at the last minute. Initially, the president, who was then President Franklin D. Roosevelt, refused to meet with the leaders, with A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders. But at the last minute, convinced that it would probably be embarrassing for the United States to have a mass march of African Americans protesting racial discrimination in the middle of the preparation for the Second World War. Roosevelt agreed to meet with Randolph and other leaders of the march and meet what was their primary demand, which was the issuing of an executive order banning racial discrimination by defense contractors during the war.
Now, despite the fact that the 1941 march was called off, it was hardly the end of the movement to put economic justice at the heart of the fight for racial justice. How do we see the movement evolve leading up to the 1963 march?
Right. Well, many people were actually upset that A. Philip Randolph had called off the first march. They felt that they didn't actually get everything they wanted. This was a fairly narrow executive order. It applied only to defense contractors, to federal defense contractors. It also applied only to the war. So the minute the war was over, this would expire. And so A. Philip Randolph said at the time, he said, we are going to probably have to march again. And this started a nationwide movement to pass a federal law that would ban employment discrimination. And throughout that period, A. Philip Randolph continued to organize for this movement. It became, in some ways, the first nationwide mobilization for a civil rights law around passing what was called an FEPC, or a Fair Employment Practices law. And this law actually would not be passed at the federal level until 1964, when what's now Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was added to that law. So in some ways, the March on Washington in 1963 was the repeat of this 1941 march that had been called off, and the fulfillment of that actual march.
We're speaking with William Jones, professor of history at the University of Minnesota and president of the Labor and Working Class History Association, also the author of The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. And William, turning now to the 1963 march, few of us may remember that the name of the march was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As you have written, it was possibly the largest of union members in the United States. How did the issues of jobs and economic inequality figure into the organizing of the 1963 march?
Right. Well, I think the long perspective is important to remember here, that initially this was the demand for jobs was the initial demand. It was the primary objective. And A. Philip Randolph and many others argued that African Americans were not going to achieve racial equality until they had access to economic justice. And so that became the impetus for the initial march. In fact, when people started to talk about reviving this idea for a march on Washington, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, other organizers of the march, called for a march for jobs. And then only after that did they say, well, there are other issues that we need to involve in this. We need to involve voting rights. We need to involve desegregation of schools and public accommodations. I think we often see the civil rights movement as emerging first around those demands for racial equality. And as it expands and gains momentum, it includes things like access to jobs and economic justice. But in fact, I think we need to remember that it was in some ways the reverse case, that the jobs and economic justice was the primary initiative. And then later, these demands for things like voting rights and desegregation were added to the agenda.
Now, A. Philip Randolph was one of the first speakers at the 1963 March on Washington, and you've said he set the tone for the march. What was the message A. Philip Randolph delivered that day?
Well, his speech, yes, he gave the opening speech for the march, and he said, one thing that is important about his tone is the militancy. I mean, he said that this is a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. He set a tone of demanding things from the federal government that were actually much more radical than were on the agenda certainly of the Kennedy administration at the time. So that's an important part of it, the tone he set. The other tone was this point that access to voting rights, equal access to schools or public accommodations would be meaningless unless they were coupled with not just access to jobs, but access to other aspects of economic justice, things like raising the minimum wage, creating jobs for all unemployed workers, equal access to housing. And so that tone, the sense that this was a very sort of broad and radical agenda, was marked from the beginning by Randolph and then repeated and echoed by the other speakers at the march.
And the speech we remember the most from that day is not the one delivered by A. Philip Randolph, but rather Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And as you've written, the message of economic justice has faded in our memory of this historic event. How and why did that happen?
Right. Well, I think in some ways, so Randolph gave this first speech, King gave the last speech. And by the time he came up on stage, he didn't have to be very specific about what the goals of the march were, because Randolph had said them. Every other speaker had been very clear about the goals of the march. And in fact, after King gave his speech, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin came on and read the full list of the demands for the march. So King didn't really have to be specific about what they wanted. His objective and his sort of task that day was to uplift people and to send them home kind of riled up. And that's what he did. And that's why we remember that speech. It was an incredibly powerful and inspiring speech, but it actually didn't say much specific about the goals of the march. And actually, if you read the press from the time, that was noted. People said, King gave a really uplifting speech, but it wasn't very specific. It doesn't tell us really what the march was about. Only after King's assassination, so in 1968, 5 years later, does that speech take on a significance and gets remembered sort of as the primary text of the civil rights movement. So if you want to know what the civil rights movement was about, people started to believe, you go back and you look at the I Have a Dream speech. If you only know one speech of the civil rights movement, it's the I Have a Dream speech. And the whole meaning of the movement comes to be associated with that speech, which at the time people noted actually didn't tell us much about what the movement was about. So I think to really understand the goals of the movement, you need to look broadly at the speeches. And yes, I would point primarily to A. Philip Randolph's opening speech to the march.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've recently written how Martin Luther King's work and his words in other speeches have a direct meaning for the pandemic we're facing. He spoke about the dignity of all work. What would we gain if we were heeding those words today?
Right. Well, I think we see echoes of King's point about the dignity of labor. And I think the importance of connecting the demands for racial equality and economic justice playing out before our eyes in the pandemic. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw the people who we rely on to do the most essential work, what we called the essential workers, people who are providing food, providing healthcare, providing care for us, education. These are essential workers, and they're also often the least paid workers, in part because they're often people of color. They're African Americans, they're Latinos, they're immigrants, and they're people whose labor has been devalued. I mean, we treat them as essential workers, but we pay them as if they're not essential, as if they're disposable. They're also the people who are on the front lines, the most likely to be exposed to the pandemic. So if we think about addressing the issues of racial inequality today, these are clearly labor issues. And I think that's what King was saying in some of his final speeches when he talked about the dignity of labor and the importance of respecting the dignity of labor. And I think you can see that as a long-term theme of the civil rights movement, going back all the way to the Second World War, and that demand for access to jobs being really essential to the struggle for racial equality.
Mm-hmm. And here we are today, about to mark the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, and seeing protests against racism across the nation. And even as many of these most recent protests may have been sparked by the murder of George Floyd, they also acknowledge the pervasive institutional racism that impacts the day-to-day lives of Black Americans, especially during this pandemic. Do you feel the movement for racial justice is more open now than it was in the 60s to the necessity of economic justice to fulfill the dream?
Well, I do think that there are ways, in some ways, like in the 1960s, where people involved in the struggle for racial equality recognize that racial equality is wrapped up intimately in struggles for economic justice. I think you can see that actually in the experiences of George Floyd himself. He was a low-wage worker. He was a service worker. He was on the front lines. He actually recovered from the pandemic before he was murdered by police officers. So in some ways, I think we can see the ways in which his own struggle as a low-wage worker, remember the confrontation with the police was sparked by him trying to pass a check that was not legitimate, right? It was a struggle. This is a struggle of somebody who doesn't have the economic resources that they need to support themselves and their family. And in that way, I think the issue of police brutality, the issues of who is most vulnerable to the pandemic are all wrapped up and connected, I think, in this broader movement for justice and democracy that I think the civil rights movement gives us a very powerful model for articulating those connections.
Do you feel, because of all of the protests and because of where we are now with a lot of these things being brought up, perhaps in the right way for the first time, the words of A. Philip Randolph, the words of Martin Luther King, are we seeing those promises maybe finally at a point where they could be fulfilled?
Well, I think we're seeing another moment in which the sort of contradictions between American rhetoric about democracy and equality and freedom are are being exposed by the contradictions of very clear racial inequalities, of very clear economic disparities, perhaps economic disparities that are actually much sharper today than they were in the 1950s and 1960s. So I think because of that, and also because of the long-term organizing on the work of people who have been organizing around both around these issues of economic justice, around labor rights, and also around things like police brutality and access to voting rights. These issues are being heightened in a way that in some ways I think is similar to the 1960s, that allows us to look clearly at the strengths and the limitations of American democracy. I think it's hard to predict how far people will be able to push those issues in today's environment, but I do think that they're at least being raised in ways that provide a very fruitful opportunity for change.
Well, we can be hopeful for now, anyway, and hope that it continues in the right direction. William P. Jones, professor of history at the University of Minnesota and president of the Labor and Working Class History Association, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. His latest book, The March on Washington: Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. William, thank you so much for your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and talk more about it soon.
Thanks, Jim. I'd like that very much. Take care.
All right. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how the Republican Party persuaded working-class voters to support a plutocratic agenda. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Gosh, our trasher-in-chief has really been busy lately, calling Kamala Harris nasty and calling our post offices a joke. But instead of trash talking, shouldn't a president be, running the government? Nah, that bores him. Besides, that's why he packed his cabinet with all those corporate lobbyists who are skilled at trying to rig our government to serve moneyed elites. Now, empowered by Trump, these special interests are our government, literally setting and running America's economic, environmental, health, and other public policies. And what a job they're doing. On us. Check out Andrew Wheeler, head of Trump's EPA. He had been the top lobbyist for a coal mining giant, constantly fighting environmental rules to make this notoriously foul industry clean up its act. Now, the befouler's lobbyist is making the rules, allowing big coal and other fossil fuel giants to pour more toxic contaminants into our air and water. Wheeler wails that his poor multi-billion-dollar former clients must be freed from burdensome requirements to limit the damage they do to the health of America's people and our planet. Burdensome? His latest edict frees oil and gas corporations from having to fix methane leaks in their wells, pipelines, etc. Fixing leaks is burdensome? Hello, if you had a gas leak at your house, would you not want to burden the company to come fix it? Not only is methane a potent greenhouse gas causing climate change, but Wheeler's don't worry about it favor to his industry buddies comes just as scientists have discovered that methane leaks are 2 to 3 times worse than his EPA has been reporting. This means the industry is driving us toward a climate crisis faster than anyone realized. This is Jim Hightower saying, talk about nasty. The Trumpeteers have turned government totally bass-ackwards, protecting polluters instead of people.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, Jacob Hacker and his co-author, Paul Pierson, offer a groundbreaking account of the dangerous marriage of plutocratic economic priorities and right-wing populism, and how it threatens American democracy. And we say hello to Jacob S. Hacker, Stanley Reeser Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. He's also the co-author with Paul Pierson, most recently of Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Jacob Hacker, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. A central idea in your new book and the story it tells is that of plutocratic populism. What does it mean?
So we coined this phrase, which is a bit of an oxymoron, to really describe the marriage of organized money and organized outrage that has become the modern Republican Party. And, we think of the Republican Party as being a right-wing populist party under Donald Trump, but we argue and I think show that actually the party has been trending towards this kind of right-wing populism well before Trump, and that distinctively, compared with right-wing parties in other rich countries, it's married it with this focus on the very, very richest Americans and corporations. So that's why we call it plutocratic populism, because plutocracy is basically government of, by, and for the rich.
This approach comes from what you call a conservative dilemma for Republicans. What is the dilemma, and how does plutocratic populism solve it?
So what's really interesting to us is that if you look at the history of democracy, go back to the beginning of modern democracies in Europe, you find that conservative parties have always faced this kind of trade-off between appealing to and staying true to those at the very top, their sort of traditional allies, and appealing to voters who are not in the top. And so this was a big issue for conservative parties at the dawn of democracy because the franchise was expanding. But we argue that the transformation of the American economy over the last generation that has essentially shoveled huge amounts of national income and wealth to the very richest Americans has basically placed the Republican Party in the same kind of bind. It has to figure out how to win while still defending the priorities, very unpopular priorities, of conservative plutocrats. And so our basic argument is that Republicans figured out a set of appeals that didn't require that they challenge the plutocrats, that would appeal to mostly white voters. They used, as we say in the book, they used white identity to defend wealth inequality. And in the process, they undermined democracy to uphold plutocracy.
Now, and I want to point out, because you make it very clear, this is not a book about Donald Trump, although it may sound that's the road we're going down. So when do we see this rise of plutonic populism becoming a dominant theme in Republican politics?
Yeah, so the two sides of this tacit bargain, right, are organized money and organized outrage. So organized money is, the Koch network, the Chamber of Commerce, which has become a much more powerful lobby, and the billionaire donors that side with the Republican Party. And if you look at the top of the economic ladder, there's a definite bias towards Republicans among the richest of Americans. But these folks, right, can't win elections without these groups like the National Rifle Association, Christian conservatives, and it's not a group, but it's really important, right-wing media, these sort of outrage stokers that become central to winning elections. And so this bargain emerges well before Trump. It gets stronger, and in some ways, as the Republican elites lean more and more on outrage stoking to stay in power, they kind of lose control of some of the surrogate groups and to some extent of the Republican base itself. And so Trump isn't the first choice of the plutocrats. He's not even the fifth choice, but they figure out pretty quickly that they're able to do okay under him.
Well, now, so Donald Trump didn't create this approach, but how does he fit in?
Yeah, so if the approach kind of emerges as inequality grows in the 1990s and 2000s, Trump arrives at the point where the party has really fully embraced a kind of plutocratic agenda and has increasingly been leaning on sort of right-wing populist themes, not just racial backlash centered on the gains of African Americans in the wake of the civil rights movement, but also on anti-immigrant sentiment. And of course, Trump comes to power, really sounding those themes. And let's just be frank, like he takes the racist, claim that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States and uses that as a cudgel and as a sort of banner in his rise to influence within the Republican Party. So the way we think about it is like that. It's like the amplifier in that cult movie Spinal Tap, right? They took the dial. Trump takes the dial of plutocratic populism and he turns it to 11.
Right. I was going to say, so even if Donald Trump really did fit in with the strategy and he was held a little higher up in the plutocratic populism world, is it your sense that Republicans perhaps may have gotten more than they expected?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it's kind of two stories, right? Early on, I think they got a lot more of the plutocratic stuff than they might have expected, right? Because after all, Trump had run as a different kind of Republican, but almost immediately upon entering office, he basically outsources all the serious policymaking to congressional Republicans, and particularly to the most conservative congressional Republicans, and he staffs his administration with folks pulled straight out of Koch brothers central casting, right? Indeed, Mike Pence, who is really key to the personnel choices of the administration, is very closely tied not just to the evangelical movement, but also to the big right-wing network of conservative economic groups, particularly the Koch network. So, they try to pass a healthcare bill that would have devastated their own voters and freed up a lot of money for tax cuts for rich people. They almost did that. And then having just failed to do that, and this is, by the way, a super unpopular bill, they turn around and pass an almost equally unpopular bill, a huge tax cuts, which are focused on the richest. I mean, the permanent tax cuts that they passed, are 80% of them go to the top 1%. And that's $2 trillion in unfunded tax cuts. So by the end of the year, Mitch McConnell is saying this is the best year for conservatives in 30 years on all fronts. But things have looked a little less sunny for the plutocrats since that first honeymoon year. And the reason, I think, is that as the party has faced backlash, because it's basically really doubled down on an unpopular set of policy priorities, and because Donald Trump is such a divisive figure, it's increasingly found itself electorally threatened. And I think there's a great quote from John Boehner, who, before Paul Ryan became speaker, stepped down because of right-wing backlash. And he said, his chief of staff said, "We fed the beast that ate us." That by investing in outrage stoking, and particularly in right-wing media, they basically set themselves up to not be able to govern at all.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Jacob Hacker, Stanley Reeser Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University, and also co-author with Paul Pierson, most recently, of Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Jacob, this isn't just about plutocratic populism as a political strategy, but also about its impact on the nation. What has been the impact on inequality?
Yeah, so this shift, as we said, is really rooted in inequality, right? It's the huge rise in inequality that places the Republicans in this conservative dilemma that then encourages them to pursue this kind of outrage stoking strategy that allows them to pursue the unpopular priorities of the super rich and corporations. But of course, these policies are massively exacerbating inequality too, both inequality across classes and, as we've seen more recently, racial inequality. And I just think the most powerful thing that they've done is, over the last generation, is really undermine the capacity of government to do anything but essentially deregulate and cut taxes on rich people. You're finding that today because so much of the infrastructure of reasonably good, moderate government, the kind of government that was pursued even under Republican presidents prior to the 1980s, is just not possible.
Yeah. Now, you've said that as this approach continues, democracy itself is at stake. What do you mean by that? Well,
there's really a simple argument here that Republicans are kind of on the wrong side of the two great transformations of our era. They're on the wrong side of rising inequality, right? The very, very top are pulling away, but most Americans think the rich should pay higher taxes and favor a lot of the policies that the plutocrats are against. But the other big transformation, of course, is the demographic transformation of our nation, right? We are becoming a multiracial society, even as the Republican Party is doubling down on white identity. So if you can't win with your appeals, which are distinctly minority appeals, then there are really strong incentives to undermine democracy. And in fact, Republicans have been doing that in ways both big and small. Most obviously, they've been undermining the integrity of elections through extreme partisan gerrymandering and vote suppression. But more recently, we've seen a kind of complete abdication of the party from holding responsible the chief executive, even when Congress is supposed to play that role.
Well, and you look at what's happening in the nation right now. We're seeing a deep rejection of Trump. We're seeing a deep acknowledgement of rising inequality and its impact, especially in the midst of a pandemic. Can Republicans politically survive with this plutocratic agenda?
Yeah, well, what makes us worried is that they really are in a race against time. And if our democratic system remains vibrant, then I think they can't survive, and they'll have to moderate. Democracy is not so great at producing exactly what we want, but it's usually pretty good at punishing politicians who do things we really don't want them to do. So we think that if our democratic system kind of holds together through these next difficult years, then we may well see a reformed and more responsible Republican Party. Unfortunately, there's another alternative, which is that Republicans could continue to try to undermine our democratic institutions. And I should just note that, part of this is just about locking in institutions and policies that are just not that popular. I mean, look at the Supreme Court of the United States, right? Republicans have, a strong majority, and it's supported by both organized money and organized outrage. And it's going to be a real barrier to a lot of the reforms that politicians might want to pursue to make our system work better. The same is true. The Senate is very tilted towards rural, thus Republican areas. And so I think we have to really take seriously the idea that we have to reform our political system as well as focus on elections.
How do Democrats fight back? I mean, is it enough to just be outraged at the failings of Trump and his party? Is the nation, enough of the nation anyway, ready to hear a different message and act on that different message?
Well, I think the COVID crisis has really been an enormous shock to the political system in a way that has really undermined the credibility of the approach that the Republican Party has been taking. And, that's not something that we could have predicted when we finished this book, but it drives home that a lot of the policies that are being pursued are just not that popular, particularly when they run afoul, as they have recently, of marshaling our government to help a broad cross-section of Americans deal with crises in their lives. And so that's the optimistic take on a terrible situation, is that it is shook loose the kind of realities of what the Republican Party has become. But to us, the thing to keep in mind is that Donald Trump didn't create this, and just his being defeated in November, it won't alone get rid of it. We have to understand that the deep structural inequalities in our country are really leading our politics toward this kind of destructive dynamic that could arise again if we don't pursue both measures to reduce our extreme inequality across lines of class and race, and adopt sensible political reforms that make our political system work better.
The name of the book, Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. The co-author, Jacob Hacker, Stanley Reeser Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jacob, we certainly appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and do it again soon.
I'd love that as well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with leading psychiatrists about the pathologies that control Donald Trump and put American democracy at risk.
One of the most powerful emotions we all have is shame. Dr. James Gilligan was on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School and for 13 years, director of the Harvard Institute of Law and Psychiatry. Dr. Gilligan speaks to the centrality of shame in Donald Trump's emotional makeup.
The thing that alarms me about him is I've spent 50 years working with the most dangerous people our society produces. Murderers, multiple murderers, serial rapists, you name it. What I've discovered is in all of them, they are enormously hypersensitive to feelings of shame and humiliation. When I ask them why they killed somebody, they say because he disrespected me or he laughed at me and so forth. Trump would be a textbook example of what I call a shame-driven personality. I can put him in a textbook. In his speech to the governors, he mentioned that they were going to look like a bunch of jerks unless they stopped being too careful with the people protesting. Said, you're making yourself look like fools. Minnesota had become a laughingstock all over the world. What he's articulating there are his concerns. He's concerned that he is going to be a laughingstock or treated as a fool or turned into a fool or would be treated like a jerk. Because he is hypersensitive to those themes, he hands them off to other people. The way that people who feel inferior or inadequate deal with that, in my experience, is by trying to put it onto other people. Trump specializes in thinking up insulting nicknames to ridicule anybody who criticizes him. This is his way of making sure they won't ridicule him. He's sometimes misunderstood as being shameless. In fact, there has never been a more shame-dominated president in our history. But the reason he's seen as shameless is because he is not ashamed of things that anybody else might feel guilty about. He's proud of them, just like the criminals I've worked with in prison. My staff and I used to say, you never meet a guilty man in prison, meaning not that they denied they'd committed the act they were committed for, but that they had no capacity for feelings of guilt about having grievously harmed somebody else. The same is true of Trump. He doesn't feel ashamed of what he does to other people. He is proud of it. But that's precisely his pathology. He has all the symptoms of psychopathy or sociopathy, or what we call antisocial personality disorder. This pattern of repeating lies, there's a name for that in psychiatry. It's called psychopathic liar. People who just lie constantly, not that they even always have to. They just get pleasure from feeling that they can deceive other people, which means they can fool other people, which means they turn other people into fools so that they themselves won't be seen as a fool, which is their fear. He just does this thousands of times. We've never had a president like that.
Harper West, joining us now, is a psychotherapist and one of the contributors to the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump.
Because he has no conscience, people who have that antisocial type of personality, they don't experience guilt and shame. They don't have any remorse. So they're going to say and do whatever pleases him in that moment to get people to do whatever he wants or to get approval. Again, very short-sighted and self-centered. Shame is a primal emotion. It's deeply tied to our fears of inadequacy and fears of being socially rejected. And so it's very, very powerful. Many people call shame the master emotion. It's part of a group of self-conscious emotions that help us behave in pro-social ways. But shame and fear are very closely affiliated. And unfortunately, in people like Trump, he has a lot of inadequacies, a lot of fears of being embarrassed and humiliated. And he has adopted a lot of very unhealthy behaviors and responses to this. We call it poor shame tolerance. And this is what hijacks his brain. He feels inadequate, and then he engages in all kinds of unhealthy coping mechanisms, so to speak, largely driven by fear and anger. And then he acts out, and that's why he can't do the right thing, because he's being taken over by this very primal emotion of shame and of fear, and he cannot control himself.
Dr. Gilligan has studied a lot of criminals, but he sees something else in Donald Trump. Not just shame, but strong dictatorial tendencies. We see that every day. Dr. Gilligan explains how it's a driver for Donald Trump's actions.
He could walk out of the prisons that I've worked with people in. But as I said, the only difference between him and them is because he's got a lot of wealth and power, he doesn't need to do the violence himself. He gets his followers to do it for him, just like the worst dictators of the past have done. Trump has repeatedly urged his followers to commit lethal violence. This started even before he was elected, when he reminded his followers that they could always assassinate Hillary Clinton if she got elected president and he didn't. And he said that at the very least throw her in prison, but they could kill her. He led crowds in chants of lock her up. But he also said if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. He said that in a political rally. Well, you know what the Second Amendment people are, people with guns. And you know what people do with guns? If they're going to use them, they shoot people with them. So he was really telling his followers, they could assassinate his political rival. This is a bid to become the first dictator in American history.
More on Trump the dictator from Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Henry Friedman.
In watching him campaign and watching the election, I was aware of certain character traits and certain styles that were very much those of totalitarian leaders, including the identification of an enemy, the construction of a pseudo-disaster. Remember, he said it was American carnage, and I thought, oh, he's going to say it's American carnage. There isn't any carnage, but he will cure it. He will do what dictators do. He will announce that he has cured the terrible state that he took over. I say about President Trump that he's somebody you can depend upon to always do the worst thing, to always respond in the way that's totally oppositional to what a more empathic, comprehending person would say, but is always exactly like a person who had a dictator-type personality would do. And we've seen it so many times in history, and I feel like it's history repeating itself. When I first wrote this, I wrote about Hitler and Stalin and the way in which Trump's identification of an enemy of the Mexicans and illegal immigrants was like Hitler's identification of the Jews. People always get shocked if you say Hitler. But the more this has gone on, the more I see the parallels and the more I see underlying fundamental characteristics that can be shifted from one place to the other, just taking into account the differences in the United States from Weimar Germany. There were differences. We've had a strong society and government, and he's managed to fragment it, but he doesn't have the power that Hitler had to do the same thing.
Of course, you can't become a dictator all by yourself. You need help, as we hear from Dr. Judith Herman on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School and one of the most renowned psychiatrists in the country.
As he repeatedly tested the limits of what he could get away with and saw that, in fact, he was going to be enabled by his Republican Party, that he would become bolder in his demands to be the all-powerful leader that he wished to be. Trump's admiration for dictators and desire to be like them, not as simply a kind of narcissistic fantasy, which would be merely pathetic, if not dangerous, if it were not so serious. These are bids to see whether he can, in fact, become the first autocratic dictator in our country. And he has already made many bids of this sort. And then if he gets pushback, he retreats and says he doesn't mean it and that he was just kidding. And anyway, that happened yesterday, so that didn't really happen. And what he said today is what's real. But this is how countries slide from some kind of representative democracy into dictatorship. So some of it is wanting to appear like a strong man. You know, his idol, Mr. Putin, wrestles with tigers and that sort of thing. How could he bow down to a virus, something that nobody can even see? Someone with such clear authoritarian pretensions and such grandiosity, saying things like, only I can fix America, and such impulsivity and sociopathy and paranoia, all of those features made me think that this was a dangerous would-be demagogue.
Dr. Friedman of Harvard adds this.
Remember the things that he does, tweeting all the time, being in the public image, being on TV, these are what dictators do. Remember, in all the dictators, there's a picture of them in every household. We have got that with him. He's in every household, every minute, every day, every headline.
Of course, Donald Trump has not yet succeeded in becoming a dictator, although Lord knows he's tried, but he is the commander-in-chief, and as such, sits atop the entire armed forces of the United States, including, of course, the Army, which has a field manual on leader development. Psychiatrist Prudence Gorgashon is past president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She adapted that field manual on leader development from the Army to Donald Trump and measured him against the 5 standards set for any officer in the U.S. Army. Dr. Gorgashon runs them down.
Well, these are in no particular order of priority. They're all essential. So one is trust, the ability to trust other people and to inspire trust in others. Second is self-control or discipline. The Army calls it discipline. And that's the capacity to have a feeling or thought and then think before you act on it. A third is empathy, the capacity to understand, to grasp what other people are feeling or thinking as they are feeling it, to stand in other people's shoes, not as you would react in their shoes, but as they are. And then there is self-awareness, and that's the ability to monitor yourself. If you've made a mistake, you can recognize it. You can see the processes in your mind and in your actions that led to the mistake. If you react emotionally, you can monitor that and try to understand why and correct yourself. Learn. Basically, self-awareness is necessary to learn. If you can't learn, you can't do anything other than what you've always done. And finally, is very important, is critical thinking, the ability and judgment. The ability, and that's a very complex one, but it's basically the ability to bring in information, to know what information you need, to compare it to other sets of information, other experiences, organize it, sift through it, and make a decision based on a rational thought process.
I asked Dr. Gorgashon how Trump measured up to those standards.
He fails all 5, which is really amazing. I have a friend, a professor of political science, Richard Rupp, and he's a presidential scholar of sorts, especially a Nixonian scholar. We went through Presidents Nixon, Johnson, Reagan, and even Nixon had 2 of those traits. Nobody else came close to not having any. So what I've been preoccupied is, what does it mean if you, by my little measure, if you have no traits that you need, no capacities that are necessary to be a competent leader? What does that mean? And now we've seen what it means. We've seen manifestations of what happens when that's true. One of the traits in my 5-point assessment is empathy, which I was very surprised the Army mentions in their leadership manual. They stress the need for empathy for many reasons. You can't have a cohesive, functioning team without empathy. You can't communicate without empathy because you don't know if your message is being heard or how it's being heard. You can't integrate diverse perspectives. The fundamental thing about the preening while people are dying is there are no people dying. I think, for Trump. There are no other people. People don't exist outside of those who are serving him, praising him, keeping him going. He is, as far as I can tell, unable to keep the existence, the reality of other people in his mind, or even let it enter his mind. And this is such a profound lack. We can hardly understand it. We can hardly believe it. One of the challenges I had when I was developing my 5-point model was I wanted to add reality testing, which is a psychological concept. And it's basically the ability to tell that something that you're feeling or your thought has some connection to reality or doesn't, or it's coming from some emotional place in you. And he has very little. When I was interviewed during the campaign, I was asked about Trump's lying. And I remember being very puzzled about how to talk about it, because I don't know if he's lying, because I think often he starts out lying, or makes up something that he wants to be true, and then he believes it. And then you can't call it lying, because lying is a deliberate falsehood. So I wanted to include reality testing in my model, but it's not in the Army leadership manual. And I wanted to stick to that. And I thought, why isn't it in there? Because the Army is going to assume you're going to tell the truth. You're going to have a relationship with reality. They don't need to mention that. And the fact that we're at the point where we're even discussing this seems incredibly ominous to me. Always has been.
To sum up to this point, Donald Trump is driven by shame, is a wannabe dictator, and failed on all 5 qualities that the Army requires of any officer. That would make any intelligent human being kind of feel badly about themselves, no? So does Donald Trump have low self-esteem? Yes, say our psychiatrists and psychologists. And according to Stanford University Professor Emeritus Dr. Philip Zimbardo, that low self-esteem of Donald Trump, that inadequacy, dictates a great deal of his behavior.
He's mentally inadequate to perform the job that he has been elected for, and that over time, his behavior, his mannerisms are showing more and more signs of his unraveling, of his awareness at some level that he is inadequate for this incredibly difficult, challenging job. But he can't admit that to himself or to anyone else. So a lot of what you see is covering up inadequacies. But sometimes the cover-up makes the situation worse and worse.
Here again is former Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. James Gilligan.
This need to present himself as omnipotent and the greatest person who's ever lived and so forth is precisely his defense against actually feeling inferior, like he's a nobody. And the way to say I'm a nobody is to say I'm everything. It's so obvious. It's amazing to me that he isn't aware of that himself.
Dr. Judith Herman, again of the Harvard Medical School, adds this comment.
It's also, I think, at the root of his hatred of what he calls the elites and the deep state. He wasn't Ivy League material. He made his bone spurs the excuse for not serving in Vietnam. He went and hid in a bunker in the White House. He knows somewhere deep down that he is a coward, that he is ignorant, that he is a con man, and his longing to be admired and accepted as something he is not is part of the shame and part of the rage that goes with deep humiliation.
Now, you might wonder, does Donald Trump even know he's inadequate? Clinical psychologist Dr. Stephen Soltz says, you bet he does.
And at some level, he knows it. The grandiosity is defensive. He knows that people don't think much of him. He constantly needs the adulation because he's constantly in this world where he isn't up to the tasks of time, and he's afraid that people will notice it. In fact, I think he knows that people notice it, and so he constantly needs more adulation. He's dying to be in front of the big crowds at the rallies again, because there's this brief interaction where he can only be the hero, the great leader, and he doesn't have any of the consequences, doesn't have any of the people around him rolling their eyes and basically saying, you really can't do that, sir. To me, it suggests that he is incredibly insecure, that this is defensive. It goes to the extent where it gets ludicrous. The crowds at the inauguration, anyone who looked at the pictures knew that that wasn't true. So, but it's combined in him with his sadism. Basically, it's not just that he's got the biggest crowds, but he's the fact that he can force you to say that when you know it's not true. So you humiliate Sean Spicer, the press person at the White House at the time, who had to give press conferences talking about these enormous crowds that he perfectly well knew didn't exist. And I think it's the domination that goes along with the lying. It's the fact that I can get away with it.
Psychotherapist Harper West reveals how Trump's feelings of inadequacy drive his aberrant behavior.
He reacts so much to fears of inadequacy that he's just doing anything he can do to scramble around in that present moment to get away from this feeling of shame. And if that means he has to lie, if that means he has to attack other people personally, if that means he has to just spew out a word salad of incoherent comments and phrases, he'll do it just to get away from the feeling of inadequacy.
A lot of people say that Donald Trump's this way because he's just a toddler with an underdeveloped or undeveloped adult emotional structure. Yeah, we hear that toddler theory a lot. Two of our experts, psychiatrist Dr. Prudence Gorgashon and psychiatrist Henry Friedman, address that Trump is a child question.
I think it's one of the great errors in the otherwise excellent journalistic attempt to capture him. Kind of trying to say he's like a child. He is not like a child. He is like a dangerous adult. A dangerous adult is not a child. A dangerous adult is a dangerous adult. And it is very important that there's nothing infantile about him. There's nothing that resembles a tantrum. This is the anger of someone who can say, kill him. Believe me, if he had his way, there'd be a number of people who would disappear from the media. So I don't think that this has got to do with the tantrums of children, because he is very much, he's a overreactive, wild adult. But I don't think we say that comes from being a child.
Well, I understand why people talk about him as a child, why they use that trope to try to understand what's going on with him, because children have to face certain challenges like learning to regulate their emotions. They have to develop impulse control. They have to develop empathy, or if hopefully they have to learn to think critically. So he didn't learn all those things. There's a lot of arrested development on all those fronts. And yet, as someone said, it's an insult to children to call him child.
We analysts make the mistake of assuming that there isn't choice that people make. You say he hasn't developed certain skills. I think he chose at many crucial points not to have them, not to pay attention to them. I don't see him as a prisoner of his own character, like with somebody who has a psychotic illness. I think there's a lot of choice in what he's become, and I think he's very proud of it.
I guess I would say I don't think either of us really knows what he's chosen, what he's been fated to become. We can speculate about it. I can feel it. What we know is how he behaves and what his predilections are and what the implications of those predilections and practices.
So a bit of disagreement on that question, but what's clear is that whatever's causing Trump's behavior, these psychiatrists are worried about it, and we should be too.
Bill Press with contributors to the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. William P. Jones, Jacob Hacker, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.